Good evening. I'm delighted to be here to talk with you tonight as part of the Penobscot Marine Museum's series on shipbuilding, sailing and shipbuilding. The story of Maine's first ship starts over 400 years ago at the site of an English settlement in Phippsburg at the mouth of the Kennebec River, which you can see right behind me. There, over the winter of 1607 and 1608, 120 men from Plymouth, England, tried and failed to form a permanent colony. But as Gina said, they succeeded in constructing the first ocean-going vessel in New England and quite possibly in the New World. In so doing, they began the 400-year-old history of shipbuilding that we have in Maine. In the next 40 minutes, I'll first outline the circumstances under which the original Virginia was built and tell you about our organization, how it got started with this reconstruction project. I'll describe the construction of the ship's hull in some detail and end by telling you a bit about our plans to use the ship as a maritime educational platform once it's launched and operational. For the sake of time tonight, I have to trim away some of the history and archaeology of the story, but I'll be glad to discuss those topics later if there's interest. So let me start sharing my screen, some administration here, just a bit, and open up the slideshow in the beginning. And I need to move this little character out of the way. Good, so let's go back in time a little over 4 centuries to London, 1606. On your left is a portrait of Queen Elizabeth, who had reigned over England for 45 years, but passed away 3 years before. On the right is James I. Oh, yes, I'm also going to get rid of this video. It seems easier for me to not bother. You don't have to look at me during this show. So James I, Elizabeth had died childless and unmarried. By definition of the time, that meant virginal. And our state of Virginia, as well as the 2 ships that I'll be discussing this evening, were named after her. The English knew how to build deep water vessels well before the start of the 17th century. Spain and Portugal had been the maritime superpowers of the 15th and 16th century, but in 1588, that's less than 20 years before the time we were considering tonight, this English ship, the Ark, commanded by Sir Charles Howe, succeeded in blocking the invasion of the Spanish Armada. There were complicating details associated with that, but certainly it happened. England came out ahead on that, and by the start of the 17th century, England had taken its place as a world-class power, and ship construction had become big business. For many years now, English commercial interests had known that valuable commodities could be found along a coastline of a landmass some 60 days' sail to the west of England. The headlands of this new world, out across the Western Sea, had been mapped in more or less detail and accuracy. This is a map attributed to a young Samuel Champlain, who took part in a French expedition that started in 1604 and overwintered for 3 years in different parts of what we now call Nova Scotia. Now, Champlain clearly recognized Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and he knew about the Bay of Fundy, although he didn't get the geography of Cape Cod quite right. He described Long Island Sound pretty well, did a good job with Chesapeake Bay, and my point with all this is that the coastline of this new world was not unknown territory. What attracted commercial interests? Well, fish, cod there on the left. Cod had been found to be plentiful off the coast of Nova Scotia since John Cabot had brought that information back to Europe over a century before. But lumber was a major attraction. The tree is Pinus strobus, that's eastern white pine, 100 feet tall, no branches till you get to the top, flexible. It was found in old growth forests all along the coast of this new world, and very suitable for making masts. By 1600, England had depleted much of its forest land, and the New World could supply this both oak for timber, for hull construction, and pine, such as you see here, for masts. The lands offered other investment possibilities as well. Perhaps they would find gold, as the Spanish were doing in the south, or a shorter passage to India, where the spice trade was proving profitable. Furs, a resource, and all wealthy merchants in England were interested in making such investments. But the king owned the lands, and his permission would be needed to form settlements there. So King James had some goals in the New World as well, but they were primarily geopolitical. He wanted to claim the territory for England and block encroachment from the Spanish from the south and from the French in Quebec and Nova Scotia, but he didn't want to support that all from his treasury. The result of these converging interests was that in the spring of 1606, King James granted a land use charter to the Virginia Company to establish permanent settlements in the New World. Remember, the term Virginia now applied to all, in the English's mind, all of their holdings. The company created two separate investment structures, one based in London and the other in Plymouth. Investors could invest in one or both of these ventures. The London-based company would found the South Colony in land that we now call Virginia and North Carolina. The company that was based in Plymouth was given land that we call now New England to found the North Colony. Both groups immediately began planning their expeditions. And so it was that 3 ships of the South Colony, Godspeed, Susan Constant, and Discovery, left London in December of 1606 and reached the New World in late April 1607. They chose a defensible site on the James River and landed on May 14th. They named their settlement Jamestown. It struggled, but it survived to become the first permanent English settlement in North America. Then on May 31st of that same year, 2 ships, each carrying 50, 60 men from the north of England, west of England, Gift of God and Mary of John, they left Plymouth, headed for what they called North Virginia. They arrived at the mouth of the Kennebec River, about 120 miles east of Cape Cod, on August 18th. That's just 2 months after the Jamestown settlers had arrived. The primary investor in this North Colony was Sir John Popham, the Lord Chief Justice of England. His nephew, George Popham, was appointed president of the colony, and so the settlement has come to be called the Popham Colony. Now here is a slide of the Kennebec River as it appears today. This channel runs east of Pond Island, past the remnants of an unfinished Civil War construction fort, suitably named Fort Popham. That yellow arrow points to the Sabino Point, which is a stubby peninsula projecting out into Atkins Bay. That's where the Popham colonists chose to settle. There are several historical records available to us that discuss the Popham Colony. From these writings, we know that the colonists began building simple living quarters and a forge. They built a munitions supply house. They built a storeroom to protect equipment and supplies that they brought with them, some of which related to the ship that they were planning to build. And all of this was because once those ships were unloaded, they were headed back to England, one in early fall and one later in December, as the plan worked out. Among the settlers was a shipwright, and I quote here, by the name of Digby, close quotes, according to one of the diaries that we have from that area. Soon after landing, Mr. Digby began building a ship with which to explore the river and the coastline for resources. We might consider this somewhat of a kit boat. That would be a term that we use today. They probably brought parts of it in sections for quick assembly, and they certainly brought hardware and sails and lines, with the purpose being to demonstrate that the lumber, the resources in the New World were there for them to begin building shipbuilding. It was a demonstration project. In this speculative drawing of the settlement by Sam Manning, you can see these living quarters in a storehouse and those protective ditches called gabions. Basically, they were baskets filled with rocks and dirt to protect the holdings and to keep the hungry animals and the inquisitive indigenous people away from their work. They named the whole complex Fort St. George, and notice down in the lower right corner, you can see a small ship that's being constructed. It's very unlikely that the English sent Digby to build just one vessel. In their investment proposals to King James, the backers had clearly stated their belief that shipbuilding and its supporting trades were well suited in the New World and should be encouraged. This first ship was to serve, as I said, a demonstration project to display the value of those available resources. And the founders fully expected that in time a sustainable colony would grow up around Fort St. George. But it wasn't to be. The colony lasted only 14 months. Why did it fail? Well, when the first of the two transport ships returned to England in October, it carried a letter from President Popham stating that things looked pretty good. But by December, when the second ship left, serious winter weather had begun. The leaders realized that they hadn't planted enough vegetables and they hadn't killed enough deer to last through the winter, and they were conserving the supplies that they had by reducing the number of mouths on the site. They sent half of the colony back to England on that second ship. Throughout the winter, the colony's problems continued to mount. In February, President Popham died, the only colonist to do so. In September, when the resupply ship returned from England, it brought news that several of the principal backers had also died and had suffered financial reversals, and the colony was to be abandoned. By that time, however, the shipbuilders had completed their ship, quote, some 50 feet in length and some 30 ton in volume, close quote. That's the only description we have of it. They named the ship Virginia of Sagadahoc, Sagadahoc being the name the native people gave to the river. And in mid-summer, mid-fall, in company with the supply ship, they sailed her back to England. The original Virginia appears once more in the colonial record before being lost to history. After her return to England, the Plymouth Company sold the ship to the London Company, and she shows up as part of a 9-ship convoy that sailed back across to resupply Jamestown in 1609. So the Virginia crossed the Atlantic Ocean twice, and as a result, we think she was probably a pretty well-built vessel. Although the Popham Colony was abandoned a year after it began, it was an important building block in the English colonization of this continent. It was a sister colony to the Jamestown settlement effort and an instructive precursor to the Pilgrim colony on Cape Cod some 20 years later, a decade later. The significance of the Popham Colony should be understood in that context. The description I've given you, drawn from historical references, has been supported by archaeological evidence collected at the site on Sabino Point. Jeffrey Brain, an archaeologist with the Peabody Museum of Salem, worked with school students and dedicated supervisors in the summers between 1997 and 2005. They unearthed a variety of 17th century artifacts of European origin, including this rusted caulking iron, which is a definitive shipbuilding tool. These finds are on display in the Maine State Museum in Augusta, and their work confirmed the existence of the colony. This is Jane Stevens, a Phippsburg resident who lived near the site of the Popham Colony. In fact, her home is inside its boundaries. Once the archaeology work in her backyard had confirmed what some of local folklore had been circulating for years regarding this Popham Colony, Mrs. Stevens and a group of neighbors founded the Virginia Project, which is now doing business as Maine's first ship. They determined that they should reconstruct the first English ship. From its beginning, the intent of the Virginia Project was to research, design, and construct and operate a historically as accurate 17th century ship as could be built today and also receive an operating license from the Coast Guard. Starting in 1997, Maine's first ship began a two-phased research program to lay the groundwork for actual ship construction. The first phase was to develop a historical concept design using pictures and descriptions that were available in the literature. Now, there's little documentation for any ship that was built 400 years ago. Ship design in that era was valuable intellectual property, and like nautical charts or productive fishing grounds, shipbuilding techniques were carefully guarded secrets. However, one of the letters sent back by the colony's leaders described the ship that Digby was building as, quote, a pretty pinnace of some 30 ton. John Bradford, a historian who worked for many years on the Virginia project, described the pinnace as a, quote, relatively fast and lightly constructed shallow draft support vessel for fishing and trading and exploring and cargo carrying, with a distinctive square or flat transom. In this painting of ships on the Thames in the mid-17th century, I've circled a pinnace, and two others like it can be seen. They basically were open deck workboats, common on English rivers and coastal waterways at the time. The other bit of information our designers had was this sketch of a small ship that appeared on a map of the Popham Colony that had been reportedly drawn by one of the settlers. It looks like a pinnace. The settlers said it was a pinnace, and so the designers used that sketch as a model for their concept design. The result of that work is shown in the next slide. I just need to point out here that I'm skipping over a lot of background and contributions by several individuals, both in this country and England, who helped review the literature and the maps and other elements of the historical record that allowed us to get to this stage of the program. So the next task was to turn this design into working blueprints from which a ship could be built. The person who developed the working design drawings was David Wyman, independent naval architect living in Castine and professor of marine engineering at the Maine Maritime Academy. David told me he'd be on the call tonight, and I want to take this opportunity to thank him publicly for his many years of work on the Virginia. He had consultant help from ship's Captain Steve Cobb and shipwright Rob Stevens. Their work is summarized in a book by John Bradford, as shown in the next slide. Now, Bradford's book, subtitled An In-Context Design of Maine's First Ship, was published in 2011 and is available in our museum store in Bath. It presents the thinking behind the design process, and it describes how to build the ship. And it was followed by a working design set of blueprints and drawings that have been consulted regularly throughout the past decade as work on the ship has progressed. And I want to make the point that the historical concept from the literature was straightforward, not easy, but nonetheless straightforward. But the working designs had to also incorporate space in the ship for things the Coast Guard wanted, like an engine, you'll see that later, and room for navigational supplies and everything else. So the operational equipment that went into the working designs was quite a task. So here is a Google map photo of the Virginia work site in Bath. We're just north of the US 1 bridge, you can see down at the bottom, over the Kennebec. The ship is being built in the larger of those two white tents. The yellow arrow points to the Bath freight shed on Commercial Street, which Maine's First Ship manages as a site for community activities, including the Bath Farmers Market. By 2010, the Virginia project had raised enough money to enter into a lease agreement for the property between the freight shed and the river. So you begin building a ship by laying its keel, which is the backbone of the ship. Virginia's keel is made from white oak, and there's precious little of that left in New England. The tree can grow quite large, but even big ones don't provide straight wood for more than about 40 feet. So some milling and joining would be needed for the vessel that we're planning. We went to a commercial yard in Connecticut that specializes in milling timbers from blowdowns and landscaping projects. Bought a piece of milled white oak that was 38 feet long. Lifting it up, laying it on those base blocks gave us a real reason to celebrate. The year was 2011. Once the keel was supported and leveled, we built a hoop tent over it to protect the ship and the volunteers from the Maine weather. Now here is the working diagram, the outboard profile as it appears in Bradford's book. Bradford divided his book into two parts, the hull and the rigging. Tonight I'm going to follow his lead and focus on hull construction. Next year, once we've rigged her and proved that she'll float and put a little bit of the rigging together, I'll be able to come back and discuss the rigging in more detail and tell you how she sails. Now, in case some of you are unfamiliar with wooden boat construction, here is a line drawing of that same design on the previous slide, but without the rigging. The major components of the hull are the transom, planking, the frames and clamps, which are inside the view of the hull, the deck, the stem, the keelson, which is also inside the ship, the keel, and the rudder. I've put a small copy of this design in the corner of some of my slides to help orient you. If I use some unfamiliar nautical terminology, don't worry too much about it. Just keep in mind that the overall process is that a large ship is being built from many small pieces of wood. So the first component to be built was the stem. The stem forms the forward, upward curving part of the ship's backbone. It was assembled from 3 pieces of wood whose dimensions are specified in the nautical diagram, the design. Now, lofting involves drawing out in full size one surface of each of those pieces, and then transferring those shapes to thin pieces of plywood. This process of assembly is much the same way as a seamstress would go about assembling a piece of clothing before sewing it together. The resulting diagrams were then traced out on 4 by 5 inch thick pieces of white oak and cut out with a bandsaw. So here is the base of the stem being assembled from those pieces that I just showed you, being raised into position at the forward end of the keel. And here it is being bolted to the forward end of the keel. You'll get another look at that in a minute. So the same lofting process was now used to make the frames. The frames are the curved ribs that support the hull and give the ship its shape. Because they're curved, we assemble the frames by connecting smaller pieces of wood, 4 by 5 inches again, straight grained wood, called futtocks. Here you see a futtock pattern being positioned on a plank of 5 inch thick white oak. By connecting several pieces of straight grained wood, we allow the grain to follow more closely the curve of the frame, which makes that unit much stronger. Here is a pile of futtocks, some ready to be assembled into frames. Each is labeled as to its position on the ship. Now this is a bit complicated. The frames are built as half frames, each half frame being a mirror image of its partner and located on either the port or the starboard side of the ship. This is an overhead view of the deck. You can see the tops of the frames appearing as rows of dots around the outer edge. The bow of the ship is to the right. Each dot there represents the upper end of a frame. Virginia has 36 of them, 32 of which are transverse frames. That is, they're set up perpendicular to the keel and in the mid and the aft sections. The other 4 pairs up at the bow are called cant frames. They're mounted closely together and canted, that is, they're angled forward to provide support for the bow of the ship. The size and the shape of each pair of half frames is specific to its assigned position along the ship's keel. Taken together, they determine the size and the shape of the ship's hull. These workers are holding a half frame. That is one of those ribs that will go on either the port or the starboard side of the ship. Its opposite partner is the other half frame that there's resting there on their feet. Notice that the half frame they're holding actually itself consists of 2 nearly identical assemblies. Each assembly consists of 9 of those futtocks, all arranged so that the ends of the futtock of one neighbor, of one futtock, its neighbor The end of it comes out in the middle of the next neighbor. Okay, so they don't come out of the same place. The pieces are held together with wooden pegs called trunnels that are pounded sideways through both of them. You can see the ends of the trunnels protruding along the length of those both half frames. Here is the first completed full frame called the midship bend. This is the vessel's largest frame, largest transverse frame. It's the heart of the diagram. The frames fore and after that are counted, measured, determined from that shape. It's usually, almost always, the first frame to be set up on the keel. Here is the ship with 7 of its transverse frames mounted in position. You can see the stem where you just saw that before. The frames are temporarily stabilized by short braces between them, as well as by pieces of wood spanning the gaps between their upper ends until they can be properly attached to the keel. As we move farther aft, the shape of the frames change. This photo nicely shows the reversed curvature of the frames. Here's the view I mentioned before. This is the starboard side of the ship up at the bow. You can see the stem formed from those 3 large pieces of oak. The dark beam coming in from the left is one of the cant frames. The red arrow points to a mortise joint in the stem, a cutout that will receive and support the frame. Canting provides better force distribution of the frames and permits more nearly rectangular cross sections of the timbers along the vessel's incurving ends. So once the transverse frames are mounted on the keel, but before all the cant frames are put into position, it's time to add the keelson. The keelson is formed from 2 heavy blocks of wood that rest directly on top of the keel. There's a little diagram on the left. So you have the keel on the bottom, and you can see the keelson up inside the ship. They have notches in them into which the frames fit, and they bind the backbone of the ribs and the ship together. So to make a keelson, you first square up 2 large pieces of wood, and then you run them one at a time down to the forward end of the ship through the parking lot. We use a pulley system to haul the forward section of the keelson in over the bow. In this photo, the aft section is already in place. I've circled the forward end of the aft section in red where these 2 pieces are going to be joined. I realize this perspective is a little bit odd, so I'll give you this photo as well. Here's a side view of the scarf joint of that after section being cut out and prepared. Here's the forward end now being gently maneuvered into position. It will be carved to match the piece that's already in place. Notches get chiseled into the keelson to fit the frames. Holes are drilled for silicon bronze connecting rods that will bind the keelson to the keel. These connecting rods are pounded home and secured from below. So that gives you some feeling of how Rob Stevens, our shipwright, got this ship built. Working with large unwieldy pieces of wood, all volunteer crew with differing skill levels and unpredictable family schedules, retirees, young men and women from local schools and the nearby Navy base on Wednesdays and Saturdays from 9 to 3, Rob and the Virginia have made steady progress now for over a decade. It's quite a commitment, and we couldn't have done it without him. So meanwhile, at the other end of the ship, here's the stem post being fitted to the keel. Here's one of the transom supports being hoisted up into position. And then the pre-assembled transom piece can be fitted in place. And here's what it looks like when all that framing is completed. Looks like a wicker basket, is what it does. Now we have to give that basket both strength and stability. Horizontal stability is provided by installing 6 rows of beams inside the ship on both sides. Each row is made from 3 pieces of oak, 23 to 25 feet long, 6 to 12 inches wide, 2 1/4 inches thick. They get fastened port and starboard in both the bilge area, that's low down in the keel, near the keel, and also up near the shear at the upper ends of the frames. Mounting these horizontal pieces presents two primary difficulties. The first is that for a clamp to fit properly on a frame, it must have its surface positioned in line with its neighbors. In this slide, you see a worker using a long batten to see if the inside face of those frames line up along a smooth curve. He slides the batten up and down and left and right, making corrections as he goes. Sometimes he has to grind away the inner surface of the frame a bit. Less often, he may have to epoxy on a shim, a thin piece of oak that will fit smoothly on it. The process of evening up neighboring surfaces like this is called fairing. The other difficulty posed by mounting these clamps is that many of them, particularly those at the forward end of the ship, have to fit to curved surfaces. And for this to happen, they have to bend. Once a clamp was cut to the correct width and planed to the correct thickness, we would soak it in the river for 3 or 4 days and then put the forward end in a long wooden steam box. Steam from an old rug cleaner, that yellow device you can see in the background, would be directed into the box. After about 4 hours, the board would be taken out of the steam box and carried into the boat shed, where it gets handed up between the aft frames of the ship and brought inside. There it is brought inside and then forced into place using hand clamps and brute strength. You have about 20 minutes before the wood dries, after which it will retain most of the curve that's been forced into it, so that at a subsequent work session, it can be drilled and attached to the frames with trunnels, just as you'd seen with the frames. For additional strength, the clamps were also fastened at their ends with stainless steel lag bolts, something we did at the request of the Coast Guard inspectors. This is the picture that, I love this picture. We used this to advertise the show. This picture shows the forward end of the ship after both sets of the bilge clamps have been put into place. And this picture shows work on the shear clamps, which are up at the forward. This shows the forward end. The shear clamps, of course, go all the way around the midline and the aft end of the ship as well. Now let's shift to the outside of the ship. Horizontal members mounted on the outside of the ship are called planks. They have the same requirement of having to fit with their neighbors to follow a smooth curve along the length of the ship. So fairing was needed on the outside as well, but planks have another requirement. If the planks are going to fit flat against the frames, then the contact surfaces of the frame must be flat as well. This fellow is using an orange plastic carpenter's square to check the flatness of the frame at that spot. I've circled a location where the orange square is not flat against the surface of the frame. The worker will use an electric planer to make that area flat for 8 inches or so, which is the appropriate width of the plank that will go into that position. This process is called dubbing. The process of steaming and mounting planks is the same as it was for the clamps. Here's a hot plank going into a lower section of the starboard side. And in the next slide, I have a video of this process showing a plank being maneuvered into place onto an upper section of the ship. Let's see if I can make this work. All right. Then click next. Yeah, it's going to run again. Wait a minute. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the planks and the clamps are attached to the frames with trunnels, which are 1 inch thick, 12-inch long pieces of locust. Locust wood is denser than oak, so when the ship's put in the water, the oak will swell and clamp down even tighter on the trunnel and hold on to that. Trunnels are driven into pre-drilled holes using a 12-pound sledge. It's work best done by young, buff Navy seamen like this fellow instead of old folks like me, but sometimes the young ponies just aren't around. Once the trunnel has been pounded in through both the frame and the plank, the trunnel's outboard end is trimmed to about a 1/2 inch from the plank. Then a chisel is used to make a wedge in the end of it, and an oak wedge is tapped into the split. The wedge is cut off at the end of the trunnel, and the trunnel is pounded home. On its inboard end, the trunnel is also wedged, but then trimmed flush with the frame as the young woman is doing. This picture shows the high degree of curvature that's needed for planks to get mounted at the bow. We cracked a few of them, I will admit, until we worked out the timing and the procedures for steaming and mounting the wood. Once the ship was fully planked, it was necessary to caulk it because both we and the Coast Guard wanted the caulking to be done well, particularly below the waterline. We hired this young man, a professional caulker, to do the job for us. I didn't even know this was a profession, but he evidently has enough work to make his living at it. He uses caulking irons of various sizes, he's holding one there, and a mallet to force cotton into the gaps between the planks. Of course, the colonists wouldn't have had cotton, but they would have some other plant fiber. He then pounded in oakum, which is a tar-treated hemp product that the colonists probably brought with them. With the caulking complete, we're pretty sure she'll be watertight. Since that photo was taken, we've painted the seams and sealed them with a putty made of pitch and waxy cement. And recently we've been sanding the hull in preparation for it to be painted. So the next construction step was to shape and install the deck beams. This picture shows how these large 4-inch thick beams have been cut to a camber and mortised into the shear clamps and into each other to provide a really solid structure. Here's a below deck view looking aft, before the bulkheads were installed. Each full deck beam is attached to the hull frame by right-angled blocks of wood called knees. You can see 2 of them there, just behind that yellow power cord on the right. A hanging knee is positioned vertically. A lodging knee is positioned horizontally. Knees are fashioned from the roots of a hackmatack tree, a member of the larch family. The normal growth pattern for a hackmatack root is that it forms a sturdy right angle bend, much stronger than any nailed or glued joint could ever be. Shipbuilders have been using hackmatack roots for over 400 years to give them rigidity to deck frames and other structural members of wooden ships. The deck framing for Virginia required 48 of these hand-fashioned hackmatack knees. Here's a view of the deck looking aft once it was fully planked with white pine. The upper bulwark frames were also planked with pine. The next task was to caulk the deck, and here the volunteers could again contribute. I mean, after all, it would mostly just be rainwater that we'd be keeping out at this point. That won't be much of a threat to sink your boat, your ship. The worker on the right is putting in oakum, while the one on the left is following up with black pine tar to seal the openings. Here are 2 pictures of the partially finished rudder, the last project that we worked on before COVID hit last summer. No, before it hit. It's 14.5 feet long, constructed of 8 blocks of white oak that are through bolted together. The 9-foot long white pole fitted to the upper end of the rudder is the tiller. It will be mounted to the transom using the time-honored fashion of gudgeons and pintles. So work on the Virginia slowed down considerably last summer when the pandemic came to Maine. Many volunteers stopped coming. We stopped public visits. but opened the work site 5 days a week to our volunteers. And we arranged for small teams who were wearing masks to be able to coordinate work on specific projects together. In other words, just limiting your exposure to other people who trusted each other and had been vaccinated once it became available, to coordinate their work on specific projects at times of their own choosing. And we managed to make some headway. The next 2 slides show the heroic efforts achieved by just 3 volunteers working alone during the pandemic. You're looking at the starboard side of the keel at the aft end of the ship. Those are 2 mold-poured lead keel blocks, each weighing 3,000 pounds. 6 of them, placed end to end, provide ballast for the ship. Each one was jacked up by hand, braced, and then drilled from above, down through the keelson, through the frames and the keel, finally through the lead, and fastened from below with silicon bronze rods. Here you can see all 6 of them when they're in place. We also took advantage of the COVID period to apply for and be granted a shoreland alteration permit from the Maine Land Use Planning Commission to build a wharf next to the freight shed. We contracted to have 2 dolphins installed to anchor the wharf. Dolphins are 3-posted structures. You can see you only see one of them in this picture, and it's only got 2 posts in. The other one is yet to come. But at any rate, these posts are pounded into the mud, bound together at the top. We built pontoon float decks that will be attached to the dolphins in the spring, and we bought an aluminum ramp that will extend between these 2 frames that you see hanging here. This doesn't look like much, and we didn't bother to put it out this winter. This fall, we just have to take it out in another couple of weeks. The ends will be supported by these cross pieces. During the summer, a shiny new Coast Guard required diesel engine was installed, a 175 horsepower Volvo Penta. It was raised to the deck by hand using a block and tackle. I think you can see that, and lowered its same way into its aft compartment. And there were some of us who questioned whether that was going to work, but it did work. Now there it is going into its position in the hold. Work is continuing on several other pieces of deck equipment. There is a hand-operated windlass. It doesn't have the pawl in it yet. I need to get a better picture of it. But nonetheless, this is positioned so that it can be used to raise the anchor going forward, and also to hoist the main yard, though not, of course, at the same time. You see one handle there, but it would normally be worked by these 2 people, each with a square-handed handle. They would put it in the exposed holes and pull down to turn the windlass, and then remove the handle once the pawl had dropped into place. This is the night head, the turning block that's bolted to the deck, where the halyards will come down and be led over to the windlass. Rob admits that the carving might bear some resemblance to him. Most recently, we've been sanding the hull in preparation for painting the bottom before cold weather sets in. This fellow is cutting in a water line. By spring, we should be ready to go. Our launch date is June 4th, and you're all invited. Our friends from the sister colony of Jamestown will come. We have some supporters in England. This was all planned for last year, of course, but the COVID stopped. Participant can now see your application. Well, I hope so. Including supporters, some of the descendants of the Popham family. Once the ship is launched, we'll spend next summer rigging her and fitting her out, learning how to sail, passing the required Coast Guard inspections to carry paying passengers will be no small part of that effort. Here's an artistic rendering of what we hope to build on Commercial Street in Bath. It shows Virginia resting safely in a wharf in front of the park-like recreational area surrounding the Bath freight shed, where we can continue to work and maintain her, and people can come and learn and enjoy all of what Payne's first ship has to share with them. While we won't be operational at sea until the summer of 2023, we are beginning now to develop our educational curricula and expand our land-based museum exhibits. And we'll be looking to folks here at the Penobscot Marine Museum for ideas on that. We hope to engage students and visitors in a broad range of opportunities to learn traditional 17th century maritime skills. This past summer, we continued our lecture series. We have it on weather and tides and the local geology of the Kennebec River. Some was on Zoom. We did both Zoom and in person. Pre-COVID, we offered maritime-related activities, including boat building and tool making. Planned onboard instruction will include navigation, sail handling, other marine sciences, and will be available for river tours and other summer sailing experiences and social events. In time, we want to expand our curriculum to include colonial and native gardening, woodworking, elements of practical ship design, and all of those sorts of things. So in summary, Maine's first ship is constructing a sturdy, seagoing vessel with reasonably accurate 17th century hull and rig design that we think will be well suited to the inshore environment in which we plan to use her. We are also developing the museum and educational center to promote understanding of and appreciation of Maine's maritime heritage, as well as the history of the Popham Colony and its relationship with the Wabanaki people. We're also preserving the Bath Freight Shed as a home for the Virginia and a site for community activities in Bath. Maine's first ship is a historically significant reconstruction project that's fueled by the generosity of our members and supporters, our partnerships with the local community, and the commitment of our volunteers. Become a member of Maine's First Ship or to donate or volunteer for one of our projects, please write us at the address you see there. And when you're in Bath, Maine, come by anytime you see the flag of St. George flying. Thank you very much.